There are two things worth understanding about clockwork before this account begins. The first is that a mechanical clock is a precision instrument, a system of interlocking parts calibrated to one another with exacting tolerances, in which every component exists in service of a single function. The accurate measurement and display of time, every gear, every spring, every lever and escapement and arbor is there to do one thing, in one relationship with the other components, producing one result. A skilled clockmaker understands this system completely. He can read the inside of a movement the way a musician reads a score, understanding not just what each part does, but why it is positioned where it is and what it is doing in relationship to everything around it. The second thing to understand is that this complete fluency with the mechanics of a precision system is one of the rarer technical skills that existed in the 19th century, and that a man who possessed it possessed something that the communities he served needed and could not easily replace. Obadiah Fenn of Franklin, North Carolina, possessed it. He had been the primary clockmaker and watch repairman in Macon County for 41 years when he died of a stroke in November 1927 at the age of 70. He had repaired every kind of clock mechanism that the mountain counties' households contained, the mantle clocks brought over from the Tidewater by the families who had come west in the early 19th century, the railroad clocks of the later period, the German movement pieces that had arrived in the mountain counties through the commercial channels of the late 19th century. He had serviced the church clock in Franklin and the courthouse clock and the clocks of most of the county's established families. He was, in the words of the Macon County newspaper's obituary, a craftsman of the old school whose skill was rarely matched in this part of the mountains and whose work will be missed by everyone who depended on. Nobody knew what was inside the workshop's locked inner room until the estate inventory in December 1927. The inventory was conducted by a probate administrator named Samuel Gash, who had been appointed by the Macon County Probate Court to manage the estate following the death of Fenn's wife 6 months after Fenn himself. They had had no children. The estate went to the probate process without any family member in a position to manage it, and Gash, working through the inventory in December 1927, found the workshop in the state that Fenn had left it, the outer room with its standard bench and tools and work-in-progress pieces, and the inner room with a padlock that none of the keys in Fenn's possession fit. The locksmith who was called to open it found the mechanism unusual, not a standard padlock design, Gash noted in his inventory report, but a custom mechanism that had been designed and built by Fenn himself. This was, on reflection, not surprising. The man had spent 40 years making and repairing mechanisms of precise interlocking parts. It would have been more surprising if his padlock had been ordinary. The inventory report is in the Macon County Courthouse in Franklin. It is 11 pages long, of which 4 pages address the contents of the inner room. The probate court reviewed the inventory and administered the estate without further proceeding. What was in the inner room was not illegal. What was in the inner room was not, by the standards of the probate administration, anything other than a craftsman's private collection. But the 4 pages of the inventory report that describe the inner room's contents are written in a register that the other 7 pages, the outer, workshop standard tools and materials and client work, are not written in. They are written by a man who is trying to use the language of an inventory report to describe something that the language of an inventory report was not designed to describe. Before we begin, drop your location in the comments and tell me what time it is where you are. Obadiah Fenn repaired and maintained the clocks of Macon County for 41 years. He kept a locked room in his workshop. I want to know where you are sitting when you hear what the 4 pages of the inventory report describe. Macon County, North Carolina, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was a county at the far southwestern end of the mountain tier, a county of high ridges and the headwaters of the Little Tennessee River, with the particular character of communities that had been in place since the late 18th century and had developed over 4 or 5 generations of relative isolation, the kind of deep local knowledge of their own terrain and their own social patterns that outsiders found difficult to enter. Franklin was the county seat, a small town that served the valley communities and that had, in Fenn's working years, a modest commercial life organized around the standard services that a county seat provides. Clockmaking and repair was one of those services, and Fenn had provided it so consistently and for so long that he had become, in the minds of the county's households, simply the man who took care of the clocks, present, reliable, the person you brought your timepiece to when it needed attention, the person whose hands had been inside almost every mechanism in the county. His outer workshop was the workshop of a skilled and organized craftsman. The bench was equipped with the standard tools of the trade, jeweler's loops, tweezers, engravers, and mainspring winders, the specialized instruments for opening and working on movements of different calibers. Client work was organized by ticket. Materials were shelved in the careful order that precision work requires. A visitor to the outer workshop would have seen exactly what they expected to see: the workspace of a competent professional who had been doing this work for a long time and had developed efficient habits. Before reaching the inner room's contents, it is worth establishing what Gash found about the outer workshop in the course of his inventory, because the outer workshop's character provides the context that makes the inner room's character significant. The outer workshop was organized with the precision of someone who had spent 40 years developing efficient habits. The tools were in their designated places, the client tickets were filed in order, the work in progress was sorted by status, waiting for assessment, in active repair, awaiting pickup. The materials were labeled and stored in the systematic way that precision work requires. The bench itself showed the evidence of sustained, careful labor. The magnification equipment positioned for extended use, the particular wear patterns on the work surface that come from a specific way of sitting and a specific set of movements repeated over decades. Gash described the outer workshop as the workplace of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and had known it for a very long time. He described the inner room in terms that were structured to contrast. The inner room has a different character from the outer workshop. The outer room is the room of a craftsman serving clients. The inner room is the room of a craftsman working for himself. The inner room was different in character. Gash described it as approximately 10 feet by 12 feet, with shelving on 3 of the 4 walls and a central work table. The shelving did not contain clock mechanisms in the standard sense, parts in inventory, movements awaiting repair, the organized storage of a working shop. What it contained was finished pieces, complete mechanisms, assembled and cased, arranged on the shelves in the careful way that a collection is arranged, rather than the practical way that a workshop stores work in progress. Gash counted 51 pieces on the shelves. His description of the 51 pieces is where the inventory report's language begins to strain against its own limitations. He was trying to describe clockwork, the obvious category for what he was looking at, in a way that communicated why the clockwork he was describing was not the clockwork of any clock he had encountered before. He wrote, "The pieces on the shelves are mechanical in construction, using components that are consistent with clock mechanism materials and manufacture. However, the arrangement of the components within each piece does not correspond to any standard clock or watch movement known to this administrator. The pieces contain gears, springs, escapements, and arbors in the relationship of a precision mechanism, but the mechanism does not appear to produce a timekeeping function. The pieces do not appear to have faces or hands for displaying time. Their function, if they have a function, is not apparent from visual inspection of the exterior cases, which are all closed. Precision mechanism whose function is not apparent from the exterior, 51 of them in custom cases, arranged on shelves in a locked room. This was what Fenn had built in the inner room over 41 years of working life in the outer room. Gash, to his credit, went further than a standard inventory required. He asked the county's other mechanical tradesperson, a machinist named Eli Watts, who worked with farm equipment and light industrial machinery, to examine 3 of the pieces with him and to provide an assessment of their construction and purpose. Watts's assessment is included in the inventory as a supplementary notation. He wrote, "The 3 pieces I examined with Mr. Gash are precisely made. The tolerances are tighter than most commercial clock movements I have seen, which means whoever made them was working at a level of skill above the standard. The mechanisms inside the cases are real mechanisms, real gears, real springs, real motion when wound, but the motion they produce is not any motion I can account for by the function of the components. In a clock, the components produce a specific rate of motion controlled by the escapement and displayed by the hands. In these 3 pieces, the components produce motion that I cannot identify as controlled in any way I understand, and there are no hands or display elements to indicate what the motion is measuring or marking. I have no idea what these mechanisms do. I can tell you that whoever built them was extremely skilled, and that the work took a great deal of time. 41 years of working life in the outer room, 51 pieces in the inner room, precise mechanisms whose function neither a probate administrator nor a machinist could identify, closed cases, no display, no timekeeping function, a custom-designed padlock that Fenn had built himself to keep the room secured. The inner room's contents were sold as a lot in the estate sale of January 1928 to a buyer who is recorded in the estate sale documentation as a private individual from outside Macon County. No further details of the buyer are available in the estate records. Where the 51 pieces went after January 1928 is not established in any document that researchers have located. Gash's inventory report is in Franklin. Watts's supplementary notation is in Franklin. The outer workshop's contents were sold separately in the same estate sale and are not the subject of any subsequent documentation. The inner room's custom padlock was included in the lot with the 51 pieces and went with them to the unnamed buyer from outside the county. There is a detail about Fenn's professional life that the outer workshop inventory contains, and that, reading it in light of the inner room, acquires a different quality. The client tickets in the outer workshop were organized by the year the client work had been received. Gash, working through the inventory, noted that the client records went back to 1887, the year Fenn had apparently begun keeping formal records for his practice 17 years into his 41-year career. The 24 years before 1887 were, by the inventory's evidence, not documented in the same formal way. Whether Fenn had kept informal records before 1887 that were not present in the outer workshop, or had simply been less systematic in his earlier years, the inventory does not establish. What it does establish is that the inner room, the locked room, the private collection, predated the formal client record-keeping by an unknown period. Gash found, among the inner room's contents, a handful of pieces that showed weathering and aging consistent with construction significantly earlier than the 1880s. Some of the 51 pieces on the shelves had been there, by the physical evidence, since before Fenn had been keeping client records, and possibly since early in his career. If the collection had been built over the full 41 years of his working life, the earliest pieces may date to the 1880s. If the collection had been built from the beginning, some pieces may date to the 1890s when Fenn was in his 20s and still developing the precision skills that the inner room's mechanisms demonstrated fully mastered. Obadiah Fenn repaired the clocks of Macon County for 41 years. He maintained the courthouse clock and the church clock and the mantle clocks of the county's established families. He did this work competently and reliably for 4 decades. He was known as a craftsman of the old school. He had a locked room that nobody entered during his lifetime. Here is the question that Obadiah Fenn leaves behind, and it is about the craft rather than any crime. What do you build when you have spent a lifetime mastering the mechanics of time measurement, and you decide in your private hours to build something that measures or marks something other than time? What does a clockmaker make in a locked room when the mechanisms he makes there do not have hands and do not display a function and produce a motion that a skilled machinist cannot identify? Eli Watts said the motion they produced was not controlled in any way he understood. Samuel Gash said the function was not apparent. Both of them were describing mechanisms that worked that had real gears and real springs and real motion when wound, but that did not work toward any purpose that the vocabulary of clockwork provided. 41 years of the outer room, 41 years of the inner room, 51 pieces. A buyer from outside the county in January 1928, whose name is in the estate records and who took the custom padlock with the 51 mechanisms and has not been identified in any subsequent document. The mechanisms are somewhere. The question of where requires some acknowledgement of what the unnamed buyer from outside Macon County understood themselves to be purchasing. The estate sale notice in the January 1928 Franklin newspaper, accessible in the Macon County Public Library, its newspaper archive describes the inner room's contents as a collection of mechanical works, unique construction, provenance, and function unknown. The notice ran for 3 days before the sale. Someone read it and came from outside the county. That person understood from the description that what was being offered was unusual. Whether they understood it as an art collection, as a clockmaker's experimental works, as something else, the sale record contains no indication beyond the buyer's name and county of origin. The mechanisms are somewhere, in whatever condition they are in after 96 years of whatever the buyer did with them. They are wound down by now, presumably, unless the buyer wound them. Whoever bought them in January 1928 understood what they were buying, or thought they did, or didn't know, and bought them anyway. The 41 years of work in the outer room, the courthouse clock, the church clock, the mantle clocks of the county families kept perfect time. What the 41 years of work in the inner room produced is in 51 closed cases in a collection that left Macon County in January 1928 and has not been found since. Tell in the comments what you think the mechanisms were built to measure. Tell me whether the locked room suggests a man protecting something he valued, or a man protecting everyone else from something he had made. Tell me whether 41 years of the outer room serving the community and 41 years of the inner room serving something else suggests a man who had divided his life between those two purposes with complete clarity about the difference, or a man who had spent 41 years not thinking about the difference, letting the outer room and the inner room coexist in the workshop the way two pieces of music can coexist in the same space without interfering with each other. Eli Watts said the motion the mechanisms produced was not controlled in any way he understood. He had worked with farm equipment and industrial machinery for years and had encountered many forms of mechanical motion. None of them matched what he found in the three pieces he examined with Gash. The motion was real. The mechanism was real. The function the motion was serving is the question that neither Watts nor Gash could answer, and that the unnamed buyer from outside Macon County may or may not have known the answer to when they carried the 51 pieces out of Fenn's workshop in January 1928. The inventory is in Franklin. The estate sale notice is in the library archive. The mechanisms are somewhere in the world, 96 years after they left the locked room in the workshop on the main road in Franklin, North Carolina, wound or unwound, ticking or still, measuring or marking something in the 96 years since they left the locked room in the workshop on the main road in Franklin in the care of a buyer who came from outside the county and took them away. If these estate inventories and machinist supplementary assessments and locked rooms full of mechanisms whose purpose no trained professional could identify are the reason you found this channel, subscribe and ring the bell. The inventory is in the Macon County Courthouse in Franklin, accessible to any researcher who requests the file. The motion the mechanisms produced is in Watts's supplementary notation attached to pages 7 through 11 of the inventory. The buyer from outside the county came in January 1928. The mechanisms have been somewhere in the world for 96 years. The inventory has been in Franklin for 97 years. The mechanisms have been somewhere for 96. The inventory knows what it has been cataloging. The buyer knew what they were taking. The 41 years of the outer room and the 41 years of the inner room are both in the record at the same address in Franklin, one of them accessible and one of them gone with the mechanisms. The mechanisms are somewhere. The question of where requires some acknowledgement of what the unnamed buyer from outside Macon County understood themselves to be purchasing. The estate sale notice in the January 1928 Franklin newspaper, accessible in the Macon County Public Library's newspaper archive, describes the inner room's contents as a collection of mechanical works, unique construction, provenance, and function unknown. The notice ran for 3 days before the sale. Someone read it and came from outside the county. That person understood from the description that what was being offered was unusual. Whether they understood it as an art collection, as a clockmaker's experimental works, as something else, the sale record contains no indication beyond the buyer's name and county of origin. The mechanisms are somewhere, whatever condition they are in after 96 years of whatever the buyer did with them. Obadiah Fenn wound them and put them on the shelves in the locked room and wound them again when they ran down and put them back on the shelves and locked the door 41 times across 41 years of working life. He went them, which means he intended them to run. He intended the motion. Whatever the motion was directed toward, he wound the mechanisms and put them on the shelves and let them run in the locked room while he worked in the outer room for his clients, maintaining the courthouse clock and the church clock and the mantle clocks of the county families with the same skilled hands that had built something no one could identify on the shelves 10 feet away. Nobody knows what they were measuring. The mechanisms are somewhere. The motion they produce when wound is a real motion that a skilled machinist described in 1927 as motion he could not identify as controlled in any way he understood. Somewhere in the hands of a buyer from outside Macon County who came to an estate sale in January 1928 are 51 mechanisms that were wound by a clockmaker for 41 years in a locked room in Franklin, North Carolina, and that are measuring or marking something that the vocabulary of clockwork does not provide a name for.